Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are talking about dungeons in The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. Now some of you might be saying, well of course there are going to be dungeons. Every mainline Zelda game has dungeons. This is technically true, so it's probably a reasonable expectation to believe that yeah, there will be dungeons in Echoes of Wisdom. I agree with this. However, what form will the dungeons come in? I think that's a big question to ask. Where might these dungeons be? How many will there be? These questions are interesting to me, and we're still not quite sure, but from the couple of trailers we've gotten so far, I do think we have enough evidence to at least put together some solid theories. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before going forward, let me ask that if you do enjoy my content, to please subscribe and hit that notification bell. So first let's tackle this question of what form the dungeons will come in this game. Because as we learn more and more about this game, we discover more and more similarities to both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And with these games, there were some fundamental changes to the overall Zelda formula. Some of it started with a link between worlds, but we still had the more traditional style dungeons, just with items that we could get out of order, allowing us to progress and do different dungeons out of order. In Breath and Tears, you are given abilities early on that have a wide variety of applications, and so you can do the dungeons at any point with no restrictions really. And from what we've seen of Echoes of Wisdom, it seems to be functioning very similar. We have these abilities with the Echoes that have a wide variety of application, but then they've also added Bind that also has a wide variety of application. And so with these abilities, Zelda may be able to go pretty much wherever she likes and do the dungeons however she chooses. And this may also tie into how we actually progress throughout the dungeons, because unlike prior Zelda games where you have to work through, find a specific item that will give you new options and abilities to finish up the dungeon, if Echoes of Wisdom plays like Breath and Tears from this perspective, you will have everything you need to beat a dungeon before even starting that dungeon. And so the way these dungeons will be structured might be more similar to Breath and Tears than it has been for other Zelda games. But I do want to mention something I have been speculating on. With the second trailer, they showed off the ability Bind, and where they showed it off, there was this giant boulder, and they showed a quick little cutscene with Try. It almost appeared like Zelda was learning this ability in that moment, although that's not 100% clear. And what's interesting about it though, is that Zelda had 5 hearts in that moment. However, if we look on the website, we see Zelda using Bind with less hearts. So it's still not totally clear what's going on, but I was initially thinking that this perhaps could be a hint at some level of linearity. Maybe you don't get all of the abilities right from the get-go. I don't think we've seen any signs that we're going to have something like the Great Sky Island or the Great Plateau where Zelda is locked to a particular area and she has to do certain shrines unlocking different abilities before she can explore the rest of the map. The game doesn't seem to be structured in that exact same way. So while there are similarities and we're still not totally clear on the level of linearity or non-linearity this game will have, this game also has differences. So how we progress may also still function a bit differently, and I think it's still unclear how exactly dungeons are going to be handled. But I do at least think we're probably going to be able to handle dungeons in any order we choose, pretty much. There may be some exceptions to that, but I'm at least going to speculate that the dungeons are going to feel a little bit more like dungeons than Breath of the Wild. So in Breath of the Wild, we had these divine beasts, and there were these different terminals we had to get at different points of the divine beast, and we had to move around this 3D map. In Tears of the Kingdom, the dungeons started to feel a little bit more like prior dungeons, but still with these terminals you would have to get to. However, what they did bring in were the unique elemental themings and these big epic boss fights. I think those elements are at least still going to be a part of Dungeons and Echoes of Wisdom, and I almost want to say that there won't be terminals this time around. Part of the interesting challenge with the terminals in Breath and Tears is that you were working within a 3D space. This Zelda game is a top-down Zelda game that's using 2D gameplay. Now, there are some 3D elements obviously with the visuals, and then there is some level to the verticality, but this also applied to some of the 2D Zelda games as well in the past. And I think based off the perspective and the level of dimensions that we'll mostly be seeing, they're probably not going to handle dungeons in the exact same way. So probably no terminals, which I know a lot of Zelda fans were not a fan of in Breath or Tears. But how many dungeons might there be? Because in Breath and Tears, there were not that many. What they had instead were a lot of shrines, which are essentially a whole bunch of mini dungeons with a variety of challenges. And I've been theorizing that in this game, the replacement for the shrines will be the rifts. There are many rifts littered throughout the land of Hyrule this time around, and we've already seen Zelda doing some gameplay inside this realm that is purple that seems to be like the rifts, and it does seem to be a series of challenges, perhaps some kind of dungeon, or at least a mini dungeon. And based off the ESRB rating, we already know that Zelda is going to be making an effort to dispel these rifts, clear them up, perhaps going to different ones. And we do see from the second trailer Zelda entering a rift, and this particular rift seems to be blocking the way forward. So it may indeed be the case that we're going to spend a lot of time clearing up the rifts throughout Hyrule and opening up more of the land. But these rifts I don't necessarily think are dungeons themselves, maybe mini dungeons but not the actual dungeon replacements. But if there are so many rifts, like there were so many shrines in Breath and Tears, they may not have that many big wide-scale dungeons. Breath had the 4 divine beasts and then Hyrule Castle, and then Tears had a handful of temples. But when we look at games like A Link to the Past, there were many dungeons. Let's say about double. So considering that this is another top-down Zelda game that is actually using a map that's very clearly inspired from A Link to the Past, there are a lot of areas that are clearly based off that game, like the Pond of Happiness, these rocks forming a grid-like structure, the Swamp Ruins, Hyrule Castle, even the Eastern Palace, which we'll speak more on in a moment. But I bring up this similarity because in A Link to the Past, in the Light World, there aren't that many dungeons. The dungeon count goes up significantly because of all the dungeons in the Dark World, and this also applies to A Link Between Worlds as well. And what's also interesting about this is that we are seeing some focus here on these 4 different elementally based tribes. We have the Zoras, water, we have the Deku Scrubs and the Swamp in the Faron region, forest, we have the Gorons in Death Mountain, fire, and then we have the Gerudo in the desert region. Very similar to Breath and Tears. Now what you may notice though is that there hasn't been any mention of the Rito. The Rito were, I guess, the wind element, and instead we have the forest element with the Deku Scrubs, which if anything is just a callback to older Zelda games. And so with this focus, it may be the case that there are just 4 elemental dungeons, and that's all there's going to be. But I will say, there is space for more dungeons probably, because this map isn't just a copy of A Link to the Past, it's been greatly expanded upon. There's a whole bunch of new areas. When we compare this frame to the map that they show in the beginning of the second trailer, it's clear that this version of Hyrule is much bigger. And we also see from this frame this Suthorn village. This is a new village and new region we've never seen before in a Zelda game. So they could easily fit in other areas. And I'm optimistic we've already seen more than one dungeon here, and at least one of them I think is not related to these 4 different elements. So we've already clearly seen from the footage the Eastern Palace. This was in A Link to the Past and it's still here in this game as well. It even has these bird-like statues. And so it gets me wondering, could they perhaps tie in the Rito? Now we haven't seen the Rito in this game. They may not be in this game. It might have something to do with the fact that this game takes place earlier in the timeline, not at the end like in Breath and Tears. So they might not be here, and it may also explain why we're seeing Deku Scrubs this time around. It's possible, but it's also possible they may just include Rito now because they want to have Rito be a consistent tribe throughout the Zelda series. And regardless, that is the Eastern Palace. That has been a dungeon in the past, and it's still here clearly in this game. And I also think we've already found the water dungeon. So we've seen these pillars, and they almost seem to have these symbols that look very similar to the symbol we had with the water medallion from Ocarina of Time. However, we also have seen this Zora symbol that has to do with a spiritual stone for this entrance here. Now if you look carefully, there appears to be this giant fish-like structure, which to me seems very similar to the structure we saw for Zora's Domain in Breath of the Wild. I'm going to speculate that this is the entrance to Zora's Domain for the Sea Zora, because we also have the River Zora in this game, and we've seen how their homes look. In other words, it's not the Water Temple. But there's this other area here that seems to also have some sort of fish-like structure that's upon water that has a very interesting opening here that's also somewhat covered by a rift. I think this could be the water dungeon for this game, or at least the entrance to it. Which leads me to my final point/theory here. I do think the rifts are going to tie very closely to the dungeons in this game. We even see at the end of the second trailer these moments having to do with these rifts, and there are some big ones. Zelda is going into one of them, but then there's another similar one in the Gerudo region where there's clearly some important story stuff going on because we see some important characters, including what appears to be the leader of the Gerudo. And we also see this shot here referencing the main quests, and we can see that there appears to be this breakdown of the different main quests as it branches out to different parts of the game, and what we're seeing here has to do with the circumstances regarding the Gerudo. And while I don't think we've seen anything inside a Gerudo dungeon quite yet, I do think maybe we're seeing some signs of the lead up to the Gerudo dungeon. And from what we're seeing here, it's clear that the rifts are causing some troubles for the Gerudo, which seems to be the case for most parts of Hyrule. The rifts are going to be causing issues, and Zelda's going to go around helping out these different tribes of Hyrule dealing with these issues having to do with the rifts. But typically in Zelda games, when there is a dungeon and there's a lead up to a dungeon, the tribe or the people in that area are suffering in some way having to do with some sort of issue, and we've seen enemies come out from the rifts. So it may be the case that the rifts are going to cause problems for these different tribes, and Zelda's going to solve them, ultimately leading to having to beat whatever dungeon that's there. And also, what you might find there are the different civilians and tribes of Hyrule that have fallen through the rifts and have lost their life and color. If we look at this footage here, we can see even the King of Hyrule, when falling through the rift, turns into a gray, colorless statue. And in order to beat these dungeons, there may need to be a little bit of a jump between two different places. The normal Hyrule, but also this rift world. Which sends me in an interesting direction here. Because since we are making the comparisons to A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds that had a lot more dungeons, something that those games had was not just a light world, but also a dark world. And so while the map of Echoes of Wisdom has been expanded upon, if there isn't a dark world, then you could make the argument then there still might not be enough space to have as many dungeons. But there could be a dark world. There clearly is another realm we're dealing with when we consider the rifts, and there is something coming out of it. Not to mention, we have this depiction of another form of Link that seems to maybe be evil. Where is he coming from? Where might we be challenging him? In the Rift world. So while I'm not totally convinced yet, I think we should at least entertain the possibility that there might be a dark world again this time around, and that may provide access to even more dungeons in this game. Although I do kind of like the idea of having to balance jumping between the rifts and the normal world of Hyrule to clear a lot of these dungeons, because that could pose some very interesting puzzles and challenges. So those are my thoughts so far regarding dungeons in Echoes of Wisdom, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart, thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.